Video on life in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this presentation, you guys should know how and why the USSR got control over the Eastern Bloc. You guys should know the Soviet response to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. And you guys should know 4 key events from life in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. So as we have seen in previous videos, the alliance between the USA and the USSR began to disintegrate before World War II had even ended, as both countries emerged as the most powerful states in the world. They became known as the 2 superpowers. There was massive distrust between both sides, with the United States fearing that Stalin and the Soviet Union would look to spread communism over all of the devastated continent of Europe, and Stalin feared that the US hatred of communism would lead to another attack on his country, and he wanted to create a buffer zone between the USSR and the anti-communist countries that would come under US influence. Now, at the Yalta Conference, which took place before the end of the war, Stalin was given assurances that the USSR would be given a sphere of influence over the nations of Eastern Europe. Soviet troops had pushed the Nazi army back through Eastern Europe and were in this area, and as soon as the war ended, they started to exert their influence. So with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima by the United States, an arms race began between the 2 superpowers, and Stalin wanted to secure the areas in this buffer zone or Eastern Bloc as quickly as possible. With Soviet troops still in many of these countries from the war with Germany, the USSR forced non-communist politicians out of the countries, and by 1948, communist governments under the influence of the USSR were running most of the countries in the Eastern Bloc, or this buffer zone. The countries of the Eastern Bloc included Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Albania, all of which you can see there are in that light green colour. It was this takeover of Eastern Europe that led to Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946. And it was also in 1946 that the President of the United States, Harry Truman, introduced the Truman Doctrine, which looked to contain the spread of communism in Western Europe. Now, one of the big incentives that the US came up with to reduce support for communism in Europe was Marshall Aid, in which huge amounts of money was pumped into European economies. Now, Stalin refused to allow this money into the countries in the Eastern Bloc. So what was the Soviet response to Marshall Aid and the Truman Doctrine? They established the Common Forum, which was an organization designed to tighten Soviet control over the Eastern Bloc and to create trade networks between the countries. They also established the Comecon to give financial aid to the countries under their influence, but didn't have the money that the US had to make such a big difference to the economies in the East. Stalin again implemented another of his bloody purges after World War II, which we would have looked at when we were looking at life in the Soviet Union before World War II. He persecuted politicians, Jews and doctors, not only in the USSR but also in these Eastern European countries. Now, Stalin had deliberately kept East Germany poor and weak. If you remember, Germany was divided into 4 zones, with the USSR having control over East Germany. We saw how he tried to stop Allies' power in Berlin, which was in the Eastern Zone, with the Berlin blockade in the previous video. But he left the people in East Germany and East Berlin in pretty bad conditions, and many of them tried to flee to the more prosperous West Germany. Now, Stalin himself died in 1953. He had ruled the USSR since 1924. The year of his death, in June of 1953, there was an uprising in East Germany over working conditions. However, the rebellion was brutally put down. The man who eventually took over from Stalin was Nikita Khrushchev. Now, he criticized Stalin's policies, and he adopted a policy known as de-Stalinization, which aimed to give people of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc greater freedoms. However, an uprising in Hungary in 1956 showed there was a limit to this freedom. The Hungarians rose up against the communist leader of their country, Mátyás Rákosi, and he was eventually replaced by a more liberal politician known as Imre Nagy, who brought in many reforms, including free elections. The USSR were unhappy with this and they overthrew Nagy and they crushed the rebellion. Another symbolic moment of life in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe was the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. So between 1949 and 1961, after the Berlin blockade had ended, 2.7 million East Germans left for West Germany, and they left primarily through West Berlin. Khrushchev was unhappy with this. He demanded that the US leave West Berlin as it was in the Soviet sphere of influence. And when the US refused to leave, Khrushchev built a wall dividing the city. Access could only be gained through an area known as Checkpoint Charlie. 140 people were killed over the next 28 years trying to escape over the wall. The last event we will look at showing what life was like behind the Iron Curtain will be the Prague Spring of 1968. Before we look at that, we must see that Nikita Khrushchev was removed from power in 1964 after the disastrous Cuban Missile Crisis, and he was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. The people of Prague had been unhappy with communist rule. It was not something that they chose. And in 1968, a new communist leader named Alexander Dubček wanted to introduce a less restrictive form of communism. He wanted to have less censorship, and he wanted to allow political opposition to exist within the country, among many other reforms. These freedoms were allowed to remain in place for 4 months in what became known as the Prague Spring. However, Brezhnev became worried about this, and he ordered an invasion in 1968, stating that Eastern European countries couldn't reject communism, even if it meant causing World War III, and this became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Czechs responded with peaceful protests, much like what was happening in America and Western Europe at the time. This form of peaceful protest is known as passive resistance. However, it didn't work, and Dubček was removed, and his successor repealed his reforms. So life in the Eastern Bloc was tough. There was a lack of basic freedoms. There was the constant threat of military intervention. There was the scourge of the secret police. There were shortages of food and goods. And most of the revolts that happened centered around these shortages of food and goods. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know how and why the USSR got control over the Eastern Bloc. You guys should know the Soviet response to the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. And finally, you guys should know 4 key events from life in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.